Hello, and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we're talking about a trio of films by Luis Ospina, who you may never have heard of, and I hadn't heard of, and I think it's a real indictment of cinema culture, really, that I hadn't, because he's clearly a major figure in a major movement in Colombian cinema over the last sort of 50 years.
Yes, and in Latin American cinema more broadly.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's from Colombia, and he was part of a group of filmmakers and artists that were known as Caliwood.
Yes.
Named after the city Cali, Santiago de Cali, in which they're based.
Yes.
Which I think is the second city in Colombia.
I think so. Bogota is the capital and
Yes.
the major center.
So the three films that are on MUBI, one of them has just left, which was a short. The three films are The Vampires of Poverty, which is a short from 1977. A major 3.5-hour documentary from 2015 called It All Started at the End, which is still on. And A Paper Tiger from 2007, which is a mockumentary, and that's of the three. That's the one I unfortunately wasn't able to make time for. But
Yes, I've seen it.
So this was, you kind of brought this up. This is something you wanted to talk about.
Yes, I wanted to bring it up. I mean, for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. He died very recently, only a few weeks ago, which I think is part of the reason why MUBI, who is really excellent, has done this kind of mini retrospective. Yeah, it's an homage to him. And as soon as he died, all my Latin American friends kind of, put RIPs, and, kind of a lot of people knew him personally. I had met him, in fact, when I was teaching in Cuba, but I don't know him. It was one of those things where actually you wish people were better mannered in an old-fashioned sense. I mean, better mannered. Everyone's very friendly, but you know what I mean. I feel like had I known of him, or had I known about him, I would have kind of, I don't know, maybe done a podcast with him. Know. But kind of when somebody introduces you, Jose, this is Luis or whatever, you just say hello, how are you, blah blah, nice to meet you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of there's this thing where you wish people do the old-fashioned thing and say something about you, right?
Oh, in introducing you.
Yeah. So at least you have a basis of conversation, which is. But anyway, I'm rambling. So
you're just showing off that you met him. Your mate.
Well, you can erase this part because actually that's not at all important, and I didn't know him at all.
I know. I'm teasing.
But anyway, I was struck by this idea that there were all these people from all. Well, I wouldn't say all over the world, but all over the Spanish-speaking world, right? Who were kind of mourning him and who were underlining the importance and what his films or himself personally had meant to them, and it just doesn't register with your English-speaking friends at all, right?
Yeah.
So kind of that was. I feel I've pushed this on you a little bit because I say we must cover this.
No. Well, I mean, what I said at the start about this being an indictment of cinema culture that I hadn't heard of him, it's equally an indictment of me. I mean, it's no one's fault really mine that I hadn't heard of him and that I should have.
No.
But I think
there are structural things. It's not.
I think
what
what I sort of said to the other day is that Caliwood seems to be, from the little I know about it now, the kind of equivalent in sort of Colombia, or maybe more widely in Latin America, of like the French New Wave. But the thing is, I've heard of Godard, I've heard of Truffaut, I've heard of the various figures in the French New Wave, and I think widely in cinema culture, most people, at the very least, as you suggest, in the English-speaking world, would not have heard of Luis Ospina.
Yes. I mean, the reason why I wanted to talk about them as well is because it also reminded me a little bit of, where I grew up in Canada, in Montreal, right? Because I think there is also an aspect of colonization, right? And I think it kind of, in Canada, we were very much a colonized culture, i.e., by America culturally, right? Like, kind of, we watched American television, we heard American music, right? Like, actually for the film market, the US and Canada are considered one, right? So when you get the figures for, what a film did in the US, it's really the US and Canada. I mean, Canada is just erased, right?
Yeah.
So, but what watching these films, Ospina's films, reminded me of is, kind of the way that places mythologize their history, but also the positive aspects of that. Yeah, how things often come to be through a group of friends meeting and doing things, right? You know, that is one of the messages that you get from It All Began at the End, yeah?
It all starts at the end.
It all starts at the end,
Yeah.
right? You know, because really that is what it was. It's a group of friends who meet each other. You know, they share a set of interests which involve painting and poetry, but also kind of filmmaking, right? And a kind of a hippie-ish kind of set of values. And they decide to do things together. And these things that they end up doing together, you know, as friendship networks, then end up being, you know, very important kind of culturally, you know, and then kind of build up a history within that culture, you know. And I see those patterns actually kind of occurring everywhere, really.
Well, it reminded me of you in a sense, and I thought that may have been one of your interests in it, because you speak about growing up in Canada and editing Cinema Canada.
Well, actually, this is the Montreal Mirror that I think I was telling you about.
Right.
You know, where kind of a group of friends got together and we started this magazine, and how that really impacted the culture, and actually, you know, kind of it had an impact on the music being made, because, you know, it was covered, and, you know, cinema was very important to it. You know, I think we were one of the first people to actually have a gay listing, you know, what was happening kind of, you know, that was queer in Montreal. And definitely we were all, you know, there were large friendship circles that arose out of that, and that ended up kind of doing lots of things. But I didn't have that in mind, actually. What I had in mind was, if you look at, you know, Quebecois cinema, right? The place is so small, they all knew each other, they often collaborated on each other's films, you know, kind of, the National Film Board of Canada was a nexus for all of these kind of different people, you know. Yeah. So the sense that, you know, because we tend to look at history structurally, right? And in doing so, which, you know, we should, I mean, don't get me wrong, but on the other hand, we forget that, you know, individuals make a difference.
Yeah.
Right. And this is kind of one of those instances where, you know, you see how Carlos Mayolo becoming friends with Luis Ospina at the time that they did as children, you know, and then getting together with Andrés Caicedo, you know, it created this culture, right? And it was a culture that kind of went through cinema, but also music and poetry, and indeed novels, and criticism of all of these things, right? So I thought that was kind of fascinating, really.
Yeah. I have some criticism of the film, though, as a film, because as much as I feel I learned from it about the people, it was about the movement, it was about the time and place and history, I also found it a very boring film. And I think that, to some degree, a pre-existing knowledge of or interest in what it's talking about is kind of a prerequisite to really enjoying it.
I think that may be true.
It felt almost like a behind-the-scenes thing in a way, like, because from the start I approached it as cinema, and it starts off with Ospina in hospital.
Yes.
With a gist, which I think is kind of similar to a tumour. And there's a very long, it's almost like home video kind of montage thing for maybe 40 minutes of him in hospital going through various tests and also talking about growing up and things before it gets into a kind of dinner party with all his old friends that kind of structures the rest of the film, and they reminisce. But so at the start, I was kind of thinking, oh, this is about death. This is about looking back. This is about kind of the proximity to death. That he's closer to the end of his life than the start. And there's also an elegiac tone because he starts to talk about Andrés Caicedo and Carlos Mayolo who died.
Yes.
And so there's a kind of looking back on them, and that structures it. But I did find it sort of boring filmmaking, I suppose. Maybe that just sounds too crass and unfair. But once I started to approach it more as a kind of I suppose like a TV documentary almost, then I started to enjoy it more because I approached it more as information about these people.
Yes. Well, it is that, but it's also like I haven't seen any of these Caliwood films, so I actually can't tell you, whether they're any good or not. The only one that I suppose fits this category and that I truly love is The Vampires of Poverty. Yeah,
which is the
Agarrando,
short.
yeah, Pueblo, which I think is magnificent.
Yeah,
and I think it's magnificent as cinema, as critique. And we'll talk about that. A little bit. I think for me, like, in a way, you think, well, what is cinema in a way? Yeah. So, and I don't mind that the film is rambling, that it's kind of structured in the way that it is, that I don't know any of the people kind of involved. I mean, I feel that you learn about them, and you learn to appreciate kind of what they did, and you are looking on as an outsider, right? But I think you're learning about a culture and its changes, and there are things that make me very critical, and other things that really move me. I suppose the main strand, or the important element that I want to underline, is that I think from the beginning I really like being in these people's company.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of. They're all smart. They're all countercultural. Like they're taking their clothes off and smoking pot, and and having fun and being playful and not taking anything too seriously, and kind of very much kind of on board with the spirit of exploration, whilst having a sense of humor that is constantly undermining itself, because they realize that they're in Colombia, right? It's not Hollywood, it's Caliwood, right? So there's always this sense, things arrive here 3 years later, or kind of we're always the last to know this or whatever. Yeah. But actually, kind of this attempt, to find out about things, whether it's philosophy or politics or literature, to create it, to say I can also do this, right? I think is really, and to do it with a subversive sense of humor, kind of, and also with a disregard for convention. I love all of that. I love the playfulness of it, and there's a sense also of black humor, kind of, that runs throughout, and there's a kind of a sense also of a kind of excoriating might be too strong a word, but of pinpricking, yeah. So of pinpricking, kind of people's attitudes, or kind of people's expectations, or kind of one of the recurring questions is, kind of, are they any good, right? Yeah, like kind of, is this just having fun, or kind of, are they actually contributing something, right? Like, there's a whole discussion in this film about, Carlos Mayolo as a filmmaker at the end, and they were saying, well, he's a filmmaker of genius in moments, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so, and these are the major figures, right?
Yeah.
But I think what you also get is friendship and love.
Yeah.
You sense that throughout, and I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's there from the moment that they start speaking about Andrés Caicedo, who is the kind of first, I think, figure that the film kind of focuses on.
Yes.
And he died many years. He died in the 1970s.
Yes.
Long before his time. He was 20 something, and there's talk about him as a sort of incandescent genius, poetry and life and all the kind of stuff. All the things that I guess you might expect people to like to remember him by. But that very early on infuses the film with that feeling of love.
Yes.
In fact, that's where it picks up after you start off with this long period of time spent in the hospital. Then the reminiscing kind of begins, and the film is injected, I think, with some life then when they start speaking about Caicedo.
So what the film shows us basically is these bourgeois kids, right? And I think I want to underline that. So Ospina begins by saying, well, my father sold swimming pools, and we had a swimming pool, and so there's actually kind of footage of him as a child, and
because his dad had a camera that he
as a teenager,
a film camera.
Yes. So these are well-to-do kids, and particularly considering the context where they're from, So basically, what happens is at the very beginning of it, one of them takes over one of the houses that the family has unused, right? I mean, who has families that have houses unused? And it looks like a mini mansion, right? So And in this house, basically, they started a kind of commune of all of these different people who would subsequently become kind of major figures. And, they started a film club, showing films by Hitchcock and Buñuel, and, basically the Potemkin and things like that. What you would expect people of that generation to show in a film club. But as a way of kind of loving cinema and of learning about cinema. It also had an art gallery, they lived communally, so they made art, they wrote, they put out magazines from there, right? And, from that shared group of people who wrote and painted and, watched film together, came this nexus of people who began kind of making films together as well.
Yeah.
So it's divided into sections, really. So the prologue and the epilogue are really about Ospina, going into the hospital. It's quite urgent. He needs a major operation for cancer, and he might not make it through. And then it's really divided into, a section on Caicedo, where people begin going on the streets of present-day Colombia and asking, do you know who is Andrés Caicedo? And basically, no, none of the people know. And yet, he's one of the major writers who's been translated into English and French and, all of these different languages. And, he also lived that ethos of die young, leave a good-looking corpse, that was kind of part of the James Dean to James Morrissey kind of rock and roll kind of dream. So basically at the age of 25 he commits suicide. He's published one book. The day that the second book comes from press, his girlfriend has left him and he kills himself. And it's only after he died that all of the rest of his books have been published. And so he is a major cultural figure. But on the other hand, he's a major cultural figure that people on the street don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a whole evocation of, what Caicedo represented, which is also a way into seeing what other people did and contributed to, culturally, that were around him. I think the film is very generous, but it also allows room for critique. It's very generous because it's about young people. It's about young people discovering things and being in love and having a good time, and they're now all older and, they speak very freely about, desire and drugs and, the kind of life that they lived then, and they speak of it with a certain kind of nostalgia. That kind of...
Yeah, and humour.
There's
a kind of... I think it's Carlos Mayolo's wife certainly has a real sense of humour about the kind of people they used to be and that were quite old now.
Yes.
And she's lovely.
I think they're all lovely, but there are things that the film allows you to be troubled by, right? So in the episode with Caicedo, he used to film and hang out with kids that were 13 or 14. One of them, a young girl, who didn't even have breasts yet, who was in the process of developing them, right? And they used to sleep together, the film recounts. It's very Michael Jackson, or bordering on Michael Jackson, right? And then what's interesting is, the filmmakers go to Barcelona, where this girl, now a middle-aged woman, resides, and she says, well, people can think what they want, but it was very lovely and innocent and emotional and beautiful, right? Yeah. So, and pure and so on. So, and nobody knows it like me because I lived it, right? So fair enough. But nonetheless, the idea that this 25-year-old is hanging out with a 13 or 14-year-old. Yeah, and the film doesn't censor it. It shows it to you, and it shows it to you in a way that is quite beautiful, right? So, Andrés, who's very young himself, looks very beautiful. But these are street kids. There's a huge class difference, right? And then one of them is really in the process of puberty, right? Like, you know, this young girl is really like 13, right? Like, I mean, and she says, you know, he bought me my first bra, you know, and it was like when I didn't even have tits yet, I was growing them, she says, right? So it's a disturbing element, yeah. But I think the film allows you to see it and to think about it without condemning it, yeah. Like the film itself doesn't condemn it, yeah. It's kind of, it takes it at face value, yeah. Maybe, you know, part of the innocence, or the kind of that Caicedo evokes for all of these people. I think certainly what all of that section evoked for me and made me nostalgic for is that there is a quotidian and accessible and understandable language through which to speak of emotions, and primarily love, you know, which we really lack in English. People are so upfront in these letters, you know, kind of about their feelings and about their desires and about each other's bodies and the sensations that they evoke, and they tell each other that. You know, and kind of you have letters like kind of, you know, evoking all of that, like.
Yeah, well, it's very Latin.
Well, yes, you know, I find it very beautiful, you know. Kind of people speak their emotions. Sometimes also, you know, a shared set of assumptions that are maybe a bit more dodgy than they think, but they take it for granted and they're quite free in speaking about them. So there's, you know, one instance, you know, I think it might be in Tigres de Papel, where one of the people say, oh, he came in with this beautiful woman. You know how it happened? I was like, whoa, you know, it's like, you know, the kind of beautiful woman that a guy, you know, is just, you know, grateful to be seen in the company of. You can't help showing her off, right? Because you're so lucky to be, you know, with her. I mean, that kind of thing. I think, it just feels very open and fluid, you know. I think kind of in English, we censor ourselves more when speaking in those ways, right? Because it reveals things about you to even think in that way. So I appreciated all of that in the film. I appreciated all of the ways that they all spoke about each other, about being in love and having sex, and, you know, and once having been beautiful or not beautiful, right? Or, you know, kind of all the drugs that they took together, and like kind of, it's very open, the film.
Yeah, the moment that I sort of enjoyed the most, or made me feel the most, was when Mayolo's wife breaks down remembering him, and it's done. It's a lot of, there's a lot of talking head interviews, and that's where that is, in kind of a conservatory, but also it's intercut with sort of home footage from the 1980s, maybe, of the two of them, husband and wife, when they were much younger. Kind of playing with each other, you know, teasing each other, that sort of thing. I can't remember exactly what, maybe it was about his hair or something. They were teasing each other. And there's such love in that footage. And I think it's intercut really brilliantly with what with her kind of reminiscing about him and falling apart. And then she falls apart, and Ospina, who's interviewing her, extends a hand to console her, and even though he's off screen, she's looking into his eyes, and you can tell, and there's so much meaning there. And then at the end, she sort of looks to another part of the room, to someone else, and says, "Was that okay?" And not to say that like she was acting, of course she wasn't, but there's an awareness of the camera in this whole thing, which I think is there's an extra level of honesty to it.
Yes, these are all filmmakers, so
and like she's aware that this is going to be a bit of a film. Yes, you know.
I love the whole section on Mayolo because, so, you know, it begins by basically making the argument that he is arguably the most important Colombian filmmaker of that period. You see him receiving awards from Ripstein, the Mexican director, and lots of other people. But on the other hand, and you see him being young and being quite handsome, and then kind of, you know, you're told all these kind of not terrible things about him. Actually, you know, in an American film, they would be terrible because basically, you know, they're saying, well, you know, all his life. He began smoking weed at 14. He began doing cocaine at 20. Kind of as an adult, he drank a bottle and a half of vodka a day, and he's snorting all these drugs, right? And they go, well, and people say, well, it's true, that's what killed him, right? Yeah. He goes, but that's what made him adorable, and tender and sweet, and so charming and so much fun to be with, right? And I thought, how great, you see? Kind of, it's true. Yeah, kind of, some people, obviously, drugs affect very badly, but, kind of people take them for a reason. It's because, they do all those things for some people. And some drugs do it for some people. Yeah, that kind of, it opens you up, it talks about what you're feeling, it gives you energy, right? And so on, yeah? And the film talks about all of that it did all of that for him, And clearly he was somebody who was, very inventive and very playful, also undisciplined. You see him having fights, with his actresses or, with his actors because, he's not giving them the rehearsal. They have to do 20 shots in one night and which probably also has to do with budgets and so on, right? So he turns these 20 shots into one long sequence shot, right? To kind of make up for the lost time. And the clips of films that you see are really seemingly trashy, Z movie vampire films or zombie films or a television series that actually looks awful, but Mayolo comes across as someone very endearing, very much loved, kind of, I don't know, like Colombia's Orson Welles, right? Because he quickly becomes out of shape, and kind of clearly self-destructive, on the other hand, as the film says, with moments of brilliance. I thought it was really quite wonderful how, the film is partly structured through all of these old friends, like you said, go to Ospina's house and they reminisce. Yeah.
Yeah. And you see kind of the entire evening over the course of the film. You start off, you see them cooking, and then you see everyone arrive and they have dinner, and then by the end they're
all drunk.
Drunk, sitting around, chatting still.
I mean, Ospina says, one of the things that struck me, so two things that I suppose are kind of envy on my part, really. The first is that it's not just that they were open and inventive and all of those things, which they really are, and which, I don't take any of the credit away from them. But one of the things that facilitates all of it is that they all are from bourgeois backgrounds, right? I mean, the amount of times that you hear, oh, we shot, in my aunt's old house here, or, there was a deserted house, in my family estate, or the house that was lent, right? Or we live in the apartment that's my brother's apartment, right? And then you have this massive apartment that appears. There's a class basis to this. Working class or peasant Colombians would not have been able to produce that. Mind you, I think, for most poor countries, that would be a given, kind of if you need access to a camera or development or film, you can't be a poor person,
Well, funny enough, this was something that I thought about Vampires of Poverty, which is the short that we both really enjoyed. This is a short from 1977 that is a mockumentary, and it kind of satirises the sort of film production crews that would go out onto the streets in Colombia and film people who are genuinely in poverty, homeless, mentally ill, really disadvantaged people, and then sort of sell all these films that they would make to TV and film in Europe and get awards for talking about the honesty of the awful life, and exploit these people basically. And what Vampires of Poverty does is it shows you what they're filming, but it also shows you sort of behind the scenes what they are like working, saying, "Oh, follow this guy around, make sure you get the shot," and they're horrible people. They are vampires. But specifically, what I'm thinking of that you were discussing there about class is right at the very end of Vampires of Poverty, they're filming in like a kind of shack or the back of someone's house that a homeless person just lives in. They've got actors there to pretend that they're
it's not a homeless person, it's a poor person's house.
Right, yeah. And they've got actors there pretending they're this homeless family or poverty-stricken family that lives there. And then the guy who actually does live there, kind of a black guy with scraggly hair, almost no teeth, shows up and starts screaming and telling them off.
You can't buy me.
Fuck out of my house. And they try and give him money and he wipes his ass with it in a really striking
It's fantastic.
moment.
It's so funny.
And then what happens is he says, was that okay? Rather like the thing I said before. He goes, was that okay? And you realise that
it's an actor doing it.
He's acting there. Well, I don't think he is an actor, but he's been paid to perform this.
He's an ordinary person who's been paid to perform this thing.
That's right. And so the very, very end of the film is Ospina, Mayolo, because it's Mayolo's film, Ospina's sound recording, and this actor sitting down, and Mayolo is asking him questions about, what do you like about this film that we're making? And it is as himself. They're no longer doing the mockumentary. This is like a final button on the film to sort of say, no, this is all above board, and we are actually we're nice people, basically. And I found that weirdly uncomfortable, because they're asking a guy who I think maybe doesn't have the fullest understanding of exactly what they're doing to kind of explain it to...
I read it quite differently. So, because though you see Mayolo and Ospina, they are also playing characters, right? I mean, you're not supposed to see them...
Not right at that very final shot, though. They're actually talking to him honestly about the film Vampires of Poverty. I think.
I didn't get that. I mean, I might be misremembering, but they're clearly... I mean, they're clearly making fun of that type of person who they're playing. Right?
Yeah.
Because they're saying, let's get this done and let's go to the whorehouse.
yeah. Like, that's it for the majority of the film. But right at the end, what they're asking this guy is, or what he's saying is, he's talking about satirizing these people. Like they're kind of lifting the veil at that point and talking about what their aims are with this satire.
Yeah.
Which is where I think it kind of becomes real. And so the kind of weird, the slight discomfort that I had there was that, although they definitely mean well, there did still seem to be a kind of class thing where they knew what they were doing exactly. And it's not like they were hoodwinking this guy or anything, but they were asking him questions that he wasn't entirely equipped to answer about the meaning behind the film.
Maybe. I mean... I think the film is so interesting because it raises all kinds of ethical dilemmas.
Yeah.
And it is about poverty porn. It does also raise questions of truth and reality and realism and all of those things, because you clearly see that some of the footage is really documentary. They are harassing passerbys, right? And passerbys are running away from them because they don't want to be filmed in that way. So, they are clearly harassing, really, I think, right? There are other instances where they're directing what they're seeing. So the old man in front of the church begging for money, they say, shake your tin, right?
The kids in the pool.
The kids in the pool, which are asked to take their clothes off, right? And jump in the pool and get their money. I mean, there are all kinds of ethical issues there. Right, so on the one hand, they're acting it, but on the other hand, they're filming it. And some of the scenes where they show them giving money to the kids, right? They show that, but actually, the other scenes where they're harassing these poor women, right? Kind of, that is like a real harassing that they're.
It certainly seems
filming.
to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a film that kind of raises all ethical questions, does so with quite a black humor, I think. Very playful. This is what I meant by pinpricking, right? Because a lot of it is also directed at themselves, of, and this idea that they are kind of bourgeois, privileged in a world with third world poverty, is not something they hide, No.
Do you think it's something that they come across as very conscious of?
I think they are conscious of it. I think they're very conscious of their privilege, I think.
Yeah?
Yes. I mean, yes. I think it's no accident that it all begins at the end. he shows you the pictures of his family, and what it looked like, and that they had a color camera, and that they had a swimming pool. And then, he went on to learn filmmaking at USC and UCLA. I mean, to be Latin American and to be able to afford to study at UCLA and USC in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, you have to be very well to do. And actually, the fact that they're all, filmmakers or poets or writers or artists, it's all because they don't have to work. Yeah. They don't have to have a job. I mean, as youth anyway, because obviously eventually they had to make a living, right? And, some of them went on to do other things. Some of them found a living in television. And in fact, one of them says you could make a very lucrative living in television through all of these skills that we learned, doing these films together. Yeah, got them jobs on television. So, but I think they're very conscious of that.
I think they certainly are by the time you see it all started at the end and then looking back. I wonder whether that was something that I had questions about, though, watching Vampires of Poverty, I must say.
No, I think they're very conscious of it. You see that as well in Tigres de Papel, because, what these films collectively also tell you is that there is a shared kind of Latin American culture which intersects with the culture of the times, which is a culture of revolution, and they say something like May 68 only arrived in 1972 in Cali or something, right? But that is all stuff about revolution and about class, and they're reading Marx and they're reading Mao, right? And they're reading Marti, and they've seen what's happened in Cuba, and so actually kind of questions of social class, right, are very much a part of the discourse of the period.
Yes, that's certainly true. But yes, I'm still sort of left with the question of how much they understood and acknowledged their own place in that. Because the thing is, as you say, that they were obviously time rich being kids, but they also had opportunity to do what they did.
This is where I think the structures are important. They had the means.
Yes, to
produce.
But I suppose only having sort of gained any familiarity with Vampires of Poverty, I can't make any real judgments on sort of what they were like more widely as young people. But it's sort of there's an extent to which I have the feeling of, like, as I say, they meant well, and they completely have the point, of who is right and who is wrong in these exploitative documentaries that they satirize. But do they take part in a level of exploitation themselves in making it, as you sort of pointed out with the people? I think
they're being very conscientious. So to what extent some things are accessible to them or some things are not, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. But I think they are being conscientious in a way, frankly, that, no documentary I can think of that period is, right? After all, they're telling you that kind of filming poverty is exploitative, really. And then there are strands in cinema verite where you show what you film to your subjects and get them to approve it and so on. Certainly that was, part of the practice in some of the National Film Board of Canada documentaries. The Cinema Direct, Cinema Verite documentaries of the period. But I've never kind of seen it as expressed so vividly and so well, and so in such a denunciatory fashion. I mean, the guy wiping his ass with a dollar bill is like a very powerful kind of image. And it's all, I think it is all thought through. Yeah, it's scripted. They have a script for it, really. So I think there's a mixture of documentary, mockumentary in Vampires of Poverty that becomes much more of a mockumentary, in Tigres de Papel, which after all is, an a biography or a documentary on an imaginary person, right? Yeah. So it's really like, a mockumentary for sure. So I think they're aware of all of the strands of questions of ethics. They're very cine-literate, but I think there's a playfulness and a humor and a kind of like that pinpricking, that kind of self-deprecatory attitude that is immensely appealing, as are the protagonists. I mean, one of the things, that struck me in the film is just how handsome Luis Ospina is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, kind of, I mean, there's this wonderful shot of him in some film festival, where they say this is the most disgusting waste of money. They've just screened the film. There's a kind of a Q&A with the director, and they say, this is the most disgusting waste of money, I've ever seen or something. And he's wearing one of those neon green, jackets that used to be very fashionable in the 80s. Yeah, he looks very 80s, with the tie and everything. And then, of course, he's so funny because he says, well, what do you have to do? He says, well, kind of, I hope it doesn't lose too much money because it's the government of Colombia's money. Something like that. So, yeah, and he's got a real authority. You watch him in all of these interactions in, the dinner scenes. And again, I think he's very handsome. He stands out because he's taller than everyone else. Yeah. And also he's very quiet. He's clearly like a good listener. Yeah. He lets other people talk. Yeah. Which I think is kind of, a very interesting persona. Yeah. And maybe also something, that to be a certain kind of director you need, because, you need other people kind of involved in your projects. And Ospina is somebody who, if you look through his filmography, large chunks of it are documentaries.
Well, it's certainly true of interviewers that listening is key. Listening and also not saying anything for a long time, because you're not the person who is there to be listened to.
Yeah.
You're there to get their answers, and if you leave a silence, the person will want to fill it, and that's when you get the best stuff.
But it is odd in this film because it's a 3.5 hour longer. It's longer than 3.5 hours. It all began at the end.
3.5 hours.
And actually, it begins autobiographically. So the beginning and the end are about him going into hospital and then him coming out of the hospital. And then the other bits are about Caicedo, about Mayolo, about the groups of friends. And actually, you only see him, Ospina, as refracted in these people's lives. Yeah, which I think is very interesting. It's so he only shows you himself insofar as he figures in other people's lives. So on the one hand, he seems very open, right? So, for example, you see him naked, right, in the hospital with all his wounds and so on. Mm-hmm. There's, photos and portraits of him naked, right? So, like the sense that he's open to everybody. But actually, unlike, you're told Mayolo's story and Caicedo's story, but his story is absent. And yet, it's meant to be autobiographical, right? It all started at the end. Yeah, so what you see is him in the hospital being, suffering from cancer and what that means, looking back, on his life. But really his look back is an exploration of Caicedo and Mayolo and what this whole group of friends created, which he was an inextricable part of, but which you only see him refracted through his appearances in others' films, through his reminiscences with other people about other people, right? There's only one moment that feels personal to himself, which is when he talks to his old girlfriend, who, they clearly, had a long relationship with, and then they formed a band, and then she went off with someone else, right? But that's almost kind of the only...
Well, apart from the start, where he talks very openly, very, very kind of plainly about his youth and upbringing, that very opening, he talks about himself.
Well, he talks about his, who he is, his family, what his family did, he doesn't reveal much about himself other than that. And I think it's interesting that in this interview specifically that I'm referring to, it's still, the dialogue is still the woman's who says, I've always been faithful to you. If faithful means, kind of caring, and, wanting you to be well and happy. It's a very interesting definition of faithfulness. But he lets her speak. He himself doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
So I'm just finding that an interesting aspect of the film, that's all.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Okay.
Well, I like I said, I think what it's about is interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot. I think it's a poor film though, because God was I bored, and it was a trial to get through for me. Really, it was.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Let's be clear. The Vampires of Poverty is an amazing, astounding film that anyone who's interested in documentary should see.
Yeah, and although it's no longer on MUBI, from what I could tell, it seems to be up on YouTube in various, various people seem to have uploaded it. I don't know whether it has subtitles or anything like that. Obviously, it's Spanish language, but I think you can find it, right?
Yes. I think Tigres de Papel, Paper Tigers, is also a very fascinating examination of, of a culture through this imaginary person. So it's at one and the same time an interrogation into form. It's a mockumentary. It's an invented history, but it's an invented history. It's an invented person through which to look at a whole series of ideas that structured culture, not only in Colombia but across Latin America. So it's an exploration of those sets of ideas as seen through this imaginary person, and that I think is also fascinating. Yeah, for anyone who's interested in these issues. I mean, it won't be fascinating to all. I know what you mean about it all began at the end, though I personally, I loved it. I think you just have to give yourself to that, to that feeling, that the film opens up. I do think it could easily have been 3 separate documentaries, I mean, I think it could have been a documentary on Caicedo, easily. It could have been a documentary on Mayolo, easily. And it could have been about a documentary about these groups of friends who created Caliwood, and made an invaluable contribution to Colombian cinematic culture, and actually they inspired kind of Latin American filmmaking, for generations. Actually, made a really important contribution. I think all of those could have been separate documentaries. A slight edit, and you could have 3 different films. And I think the thing about Ospina himself is a trickier one, because he's very reserved. So on the one hand, he's naked. On the other hand, he's kind of inscrutable, except through the sensibility that comes across in the film, which is very loving, quirky, playful. So I think that aspect of his personality comes across in his work on others. But what he reveals about himself as a person through dialogue or whatever is kind of very little.
Yeah. Fair enough.
All right.
And a kind of overall a stark reminder that entry into the canon of cinema is not solely based on how good your work is, but also where you come from.
Yes.
What your class is, maybe, who cares about you, that kind of thing. Because sort of by any standards, I think you can tell that these people should have a more significant place in cinema culture than they do.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I think I agree with that. And I also kind of, want to bring up, there's a wonderful Canadian theorist called Harold Innes, and he wrote this really important book called Empire and Communication. And, one of the things that he writes about is, how when you're at the center of empire, actually you don't need to know about anything else, right? Because you are the center of empire, everything comes to you, right? So if you're an American, or if you were a Brit, up to the war, you actually didn't need to know about anything else. Really, kind of, it was like your way of doing things that was important, right? But it doesn't work the other way, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in a colony, or if you're on the outer edges of empire, you've both got to be familiar with empire, and you've got to be familiar with your own culture just in order to survive, right? So kind of, somebody in a colony is always working through at least two cultures. And you see that very much in these films, because actually they are intimately aware of the broad currents of culture in Europe and America, right? They've seen Truffaut, they've seen Godard, they've seen Hitchcock, they've seen Losey, they've seen they know the European and American canon, right? And on the other hand, kind of, they also have to be like completely in tune with the main currents in Colombian and Latin American culture in order to achieve what they did. So that kind of there's a power inequality kind of, that's at the very heart of imperial relations.
Very good.
Okay, this is Eavesdropping at the Movies. We are on
iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Spotify. Social media is Facebook and Twitter, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com, where you can hear all of our 200 podcasts.
Yes, hurrah for us. This is our 200th podcast.
Yes.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, absolutely. Here's to another 200 more.
Indeed. Bye-bye. We're now going to convince others if you yourself.